I'm Dr. Kerry McInerney. Dr. Eleanor Drage and I are the hosts of the Good Robot podcast. Join us as we ask the experts, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us work towards it? If you want to learn more about today's topic, head over to our website, www.thegoodrobot.co.uk, where we've got a full transcript of the episode and a specially curated reading list by every guest. We love hearing from listeners, so feel free to tweet or email us, and would also so appreciate you leaving us a review on the podcast app. But until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode.
In this episode, we talk to Professor Elizabeth Wilson, who's a professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Emory University. We talk about guts, bowels, penises, Freud, and technology. I hope you enjoy the show.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's really wonderful to get a chance to chat. So just to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what's brought you to thinking about feminism, science, and technology?
Well, good morning, Kerry and Eleanor. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very grateful to be in the company of some really terrific guests over the last few years. I am Elizabeth Wilson. I'm a professor in the Department of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies at Emory University. I've always worked in WGSS, but I'm actually trained at both the undergraduate and the postgraduate level as a psychologist in actually very traditional scientific environments. So I was what I think now would be called a STEM kid, a STEM undergraduate. And my graduate work was in connectionism, which back when I was doing this work in the 1990s was this conglomeration of a cognitive model of mind with emerging neurological theories. So it was an attempt to put together biological and cognitive modeling of mind. And what I realized as I started reading this work in the 1990s, all my colleagues around me were doing this work, was that it looked remarkably like what Freud had done back in the 1890s, 100 years earlier, in his unpublished work on the Project for Scientific Psychology. And there was a really virtuoso reading by Derrida of this early Freudian work. So there was this strange triangulation between then contemporary scientific and technical work with this both psychoanalytic and deconstructive reading practice. So there's a logic to say that my work has always been in feminist science studies, which is true. But there's another thread, I think, about that I've always been interested in questions of psychology, questions of mind, how to think about theories of mind. And I'm currently working actually much more explicitly in that area. So I'm working with Sylvan Tompkins' theories of affect. I'm looking at anger right now and the work of Valerie Solanas. So I'm guessing we might get back to Tompkins a little as we talk.
So an extraordinarily diverse range of thinking and of disciplines, but actually it makes a lot of sense because, as I tell everybody, feminism is useful everywhere. So we're looking forward to tracing those threads throughout today's conversation. So now we have our big 3 Good Robot questions, and I'm looking forward to your take on those. So what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminist thought help us get there?
So a lot of your guests in the past have answered this question in the realm or the register of the social, like what's good for us all as a group or as a culture. I'm going to answer it much more individualistically. So what is good technology for me as a reader or as an academic, as a teacher? And I think what makes a technology good for me is that it's surprising. So here, it allows me to read in a different kind of way. So here I'm drawing really directly on Sylvan Tompkins' understanding of what surprise is. He calls it a resetting or a reorienting effect. So surprise has the effect of pulling your attention away from something and putting it somewhere else. And actually he metaphorizes surprise through technology, this is the 1960s, through radio and television, the special announcement that might interrupt a television program or a radio program that you're listening to. And I guess actually these days with our phones, we are constantly being interrupted with the ding, ding, ding. So surprise for Tompkins is this interruption to feeling or thought as it has been proceeding. And the issue for him then is, having been interrupted, how are you going to respond? Are you going to respond to this interruption with interest, with enjoyment, with disgust, with anger, with sadness? And so then that is when the question of reading, which for me is the core political concern, how then do you read the technology? So I don't know, ChatGPT, it's mildly surprising, I guess. And so some parts of it's surprising, some parts are not. Some parts of it are very consistent with the histories of these kinds of artificial objects. So can I extract a good feminist reading from a piece of technology? That's what will make it good for me.
That's so wonderful. And as you were saying that, I was thinking of there's a really good Serge Gainsbourg song called Black Trombone. And at the end of it, he says, Plus personne ne m'étonne, je m'abandonne, c'est fini, something like that. My terrible French. And that means nothing surprises me anymore. And when I'm depressed, it kind of feels that way. You know, there is no surprise. Everything feels exactly like you already know.
Yeah, and I think we have a tendency, we feminists, I guess, have a tendency to follow surprise with something that's a little bit melancholic. Yeah, you know, that tends to be the way. You know, I'm thinking here of Wendy Brown's work about wounded attachments. We tend to, we like a melancholic reading, but we don't have to read always that way. We could read for enjoyment.
Totally. Actually, Carrie and I are talking about this morning because I won't mention which talk, but I'm giving a talk this week, and I was told to not be too bum out, I think, for want of a better word. And it was a guy who told me that. And I think had it been a woman, there would have been acknowledgement that actually saying the truth does, or reading the world in a way that means something to people, does bring joy because it makes you feel understood. And so melancholia for who? You know?
Exactly. There's been a lot of discussions here about ChatGPT, about that it's actually super useful, for example, in college, for students for whom English is a second language. This might be a mechanism by which you could write the first paragraph of a paper, right? It gives you a start, right? And then obviously there's the concerns about cheating. So any one object can be read and used in these different kinds of ways. Sorry, Kerry, I interrupted you.
No, definitely. And I was just going to say to that as well. And like Eleanor knows, I'm often a very cosmic pessimist in how I approach technologies and texts. But at the same time, something I've been trying to embrace a lot more in my own feminist readings and practice over the past few years is this really, I think, feminist spirit and ethic of play. And like, I love Ursula Le Guin's essay, like, Why Are Americans Afraid of Dragons? And it's kind of the way that she links this kind of seriousness to masculinity, to American capitalism, through to this kind of profound failure of the imagination, the inability to imagine that things can be different. And so I think I like to be challenged, particularly by Eleanor, but also a lot of other feminists working in the tech space, to say, where can we find the joy in this? Where can we find, as Maya Indira Ganesh puts in one of our other episodes, the sort of hackability and the exploration and the play in these technologies, which at first glance or first feminist reading might be, you know, just really negative or seen as really, really harmful.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So from these breaking down these dualisms between play and melancholia, another great dualism in feminist thought that we try to break down is the one between the body and the mind, or essentialism and constructivism, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with these terms, essentialism is the idea that gender is biologically determined. So you're born with genitalia, and then that genitalia determines your gender, and then your gender determines your sexuality. And so feminist thought for many years, one of our greatest achievements is breaking down that continuum. But as a consequence, it's made feminism quite allergic to the biological, or at least not knowing what to do with it. And I definitely felt that in my early years before I encountered feminist biologists and feminist physicists like Haraway and Karen Barad. I wasn't sure really what to do with the biological. And now it's sort of made even worse by having lots of trans exclusionary feminists around who say that trans women aren't women, and if you have a penis, you have a propensity to rape. And so I was captivated by your work. I'm reading Gut Feminism at the moment, which I love. But previously you've talked about this in Psychosomatic Feminism and the Neurological Body. And you offer wonderful examples of feminist approaches to biology. For example, how depression is also socioeconomic, how bulimia is a disorder of the gut and there's a mood in the gut,
Mm-hmm.
how the bowels can
Mm-hmm.
mourn, this wonderful thing. I was thinking about in the
Mm-hmm.
kitchen over coffee this morning. So can you explain those things to us and how feminism should be reckoning with biology?
It's a really interesting question, because I feel like the question itself and the answer to those questions has changed a lot over the years. So when I first started doing this work, it's now, much to my surprise, 15 to 20 years ago. And what was available to me then, when I was interested in this connectionist stuff, so what if you do have a neurological theory of mind? What can we do with that? There was a lot of feminist philosophy of biology around, Anne Sterling, Ruth Bleier, but it wasn't really helping me to do the kind of work I wanted to do with that biological material. So I was very lucky to be trained as a postgraduate student in Australia. So there were a lot of people there, a lot of feminist work in Australia at that point that was really digging in on this. So Elizabeth Gross's work, obviously, canonically. In particular, Vicky Kirby's work has been very influential for me. She's a very, very good thinker of the biological. And colleagues around me at the time, Helen Keane, Catherine Walbed, there's a whole bunch of us who all like kind of alighted on the same kind of problem. So we did what we did, and work like Gut Feminism and Psychosomatic came out of that. I kind of feel what's happened more recently is that the wheel has turned again. And now there's a lot of feminist work that's actually just a little bit too credulous about the biological. There's a little bit too much kind of just, what can I say, just inhaling it, ingesting it whole, and not really metabolizing it, not really reading it. And so there's a lot of allying with biological theories of this, theories of nature and that. And I think what's dropped out of that is a critical engagement or a reading of it. And so, you say that at the beginning you weren't really sure. My undergraduates, I'm teaching Freud right now in an undergraduate class, and my undergraduates are still oscillating in the same kind of way. And there's a movement between we're for it, we're against it. Biology is good, biology is bad. And what that suggests to me is that despite all of this work, Ross, Barad, Kirby, all of my colleagues, there isn't still widely available an understanding of something that isn't just a position for or against it, but how to read it and how to use it for feminist ends. So on we go. We just keep pushing to make that kind of data and that way of thinking about the body metabolizable to feminist politics. And I this is the central argument of gut feminism, is I think that there's an enormous amount there for us to use and for us to learn from, so that it's going both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, ways that feminism can develop as well through these readings. It's not just feminism as the stagnant thing that you draw on to make different readings. You can kind of push it in different directions. Another of these dualisms that you break down really beautifully is the one between emotion and computation. These two things seem to be very separate. Anything that's computed is rational, it has no emotion attached to it, and you show that that's not true at all. And you say that the assembly of machine and emotion was foundational to the artificial sciences. So why is that the case? Can you give us some examples of that?
Why is it the case that computation and emotion have kind of seemed to be separate?
Yes, and how they actually are not.
So I think, as it turns out, they're kind of not. And I think there's a whole strand to this argument that would be about the kind of cultural representations of robots, computers on the one hand, and feelings on the other. And science fiction, to go back to Ursula Le Guin, science fiction is full of can the robot feel? And we never kind of ever get to the end of it. So I'm thinking here kind of canonically of Data in Star Trek, right? So he can, he can't. And that's what's engaging in those particular narratives. Okay, but what I have looked at is some history of artificial intelligence in the 20th century, back in the 1940s and the 1950s. And there, when you go to the archives, when you start looking at the letters, when you start looking at the notes when you start looking at some of the published and unpublished materials is you see that it's an affect-soaked environment. And this would take me again back or forwards to Tompkins. One of the things he says about the affective interest is that it's absolutely essential for thought. So unless you're interested or excited in some mild kind of way or some very strong way, thinking just disintegrates. So using Tompkins as a frame, I was really interested in what are the interests and excitements of these predominantly men, predominantly young men in the United States and the United Kingdom as they were building these artificial devices, and they are delighted with themselves. And so there's a lot to read for there in terms of how you need excitement and interest for these machines to be built. What machines they built? One of the machines they built was an atomic bomb. Some of the machines were imaginary, like Alan Turing's work. That's a separate kind of issue, but I think to fully understand the machines that do emerge, you have to have some sense of the affective foundations that built it in the first instance, alongside social, economic, capitalist concerns that bear on this kind of research. So the affective is as crucial to those outcomes as, let's say, the flow of capital.
That's really fascinating, and I think that's an angle that we don't maybe think about enough. Well, I shouldn't say we, really. I should talk about myself, that I don't really think about enough. I look quite a lot at ideas of affect, but specifically thinking about techno-orientalism and this like fear and fetishization of like the so-called East and how this played into these like acts of technological creation. But I love this idea of like that profound sense of self-satisfaction that people were feeling at the time, and how I feel like, I don't know, when I'm looking at the history of AI and computing, that's not something I see maybe talked about as much, but it almost resonates for me like with work in feminist international relations, work like Carol Cohn's Sex and Death, looking at the way that male engineers and nuclear scientists were talking about nuclear weapons through these like highly coded masculine ways. So for our listeners, if you haven't read this article from the 1980s, it's very understandable. Basically, they just talk about them as though they're penises in a really overt way. And, and I think this kind of effective project is so interesting and maybe a story that we should be looking back to more.
So actually, that's super interesting, Kerry. Let me just pick up on the penis for a minute, because it's come up twice now. So the TERFs and now the engineers. So is the penis a site of excitement or is it a site of disgust? And that seems, because for the TERFs, it's a site of disgust and maybe fear. There also seems to be some kind of perverse enjoyment in all of this for a lot of this exclusionary feminism. And for the engineers, I don't know. I don't know the materials that you would draw from to talk about what's going on there. But what is the penis for them as they're building, I don't know, a robot or a rocket or whatever? And that is a part of what gets built into the machinery.
That's so fascinating, because when you put it this way, I feel like the one resonance between them is they both see like the penis or as like the site of like immense power, that, they see it as it's so tied into this kind of nationalist rhetorical kind of Cold War rhetoric of competition between the US and the USSR. And so, they kind of course, like using it maybe in quite a different way, in a sort of virility way, sort of tying together of like US nationalism with a kind of immense male power. But yeah, I think there's like so much undue as being placed on kind of this idea of the penis.
And it's the same thing with the TERFs. There's a kind of primacy of the penis that overrides any gender identity. You may identify as a woman, but because you have a penis, it overrides everything else, whether you have hair or whether you have testosterone or whatever.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. And so the penis is themic. It means a bunch of different things, because if it means virility, a penis is also a very vulnerable thing. So why do I have to always think of my penis as a site of strength and virility? Perhaps because it's also a site of fear and concern for me. So I think reading, not letting them have the argument of the penis as an object, as a tool for rape or a tool for virility, always, at every instance, at every time, is a really important intervention. The penis means lots of different things to lots of different people.
Yes, but it's not the answer. Yeah. The penis is not the answer. It's being used as what do you think it is?
Yeah. So to read the penis in a more open kind of way, which is what the trans exclusionary feminists are refusing to do, and it's what I'm going to guess these engineers are refusing to do. My penis is always an object of strength and virility. Is it? I'm not sure that it is. And that to me seems one way in to get a feminist reading latching onto that material.
Absolutely, because I think, ironically, I feel like one of the side effects of this like very narrow reading or this very singular story is that I do feel like it then makes like what the penis means in real life or what it means to people when you first see it or whatever unintentionally hilarious, because there's so much mystique built into this one piece of anatomy that, obviously it can never live up to or never have that kind of meaning. And so I think it becomes in this sort of self-destructive cycle of constant sort of masculinity and such a knotty web of affects around it. And then this very normal, very unremarkable thing at the center of it.
Exactly.
As a psychoanalyst, then this confusion between the penis and the phallus, is that surely not just it? That there's a confusion?
Oh, that's a whole other podcast, isn't it? I think yeah, I mean, I think, for Freud, penis is very closely attached to anxiety, not to virility, but to anxiety and envy. And, the envy isn't only for the girls. The boys are also in an envious relation. So it's a complicated little bit of anatomy.
That's very fascinating, and I never knew that. So I'm like very poorly read on Freud, which is probably not the thing to you right now in this podcast.
It's not what you think it is.
I actually want to bring us back to this question of affect and then thinking about how in a lot of contemporary technologies and scientific projects, we see a quite dangerous return, I think, to these very pseudoscientific taxonomies of affect that even though they've been like quite roundly debunked in a lot of ways, that people are trying to develop all sorts of new algorithmic tools for trying to deduce emotion from someone's face or their facial appearance. So this is something that Oz Keys, who's also appeared on the podcast, and I exploring in relation to the emotion AI firm Affectiva, which again claims to have developed an algorithm that can effectively read people's facial expressions and deduce their emotional state from that. And we talk about how ableism and racism really underpins this project because it was originally developed as a tool that was designed to quote unquote teach autistic people how to feel according to existing societal norms. And then I also argue that it's very reliant on these ideas of normative cultural expression that, then play out in the founder's description of these technologies not working in the Chinese context and tie this back to this notion of sort of the inscrutable Chinese face. But this is something, we wanted to bring to you because you've also explored these attempts to show where emotion is expressed on the face. So Tompkins' example that, in effect, happiness lives in the micro expressions of the smile on the face, which itself inspired the work of Paul Ekman, who consulted with the FBI and other large law enforcement organizations on supposedly predicting whether or not a person is a suicide bomber through micro expressions. So what do you characterize as work on affect recognition that is actually useful? And how does it relate to these really misguided forms of research on emotion?
Before you start, can someone define affect for the listener?
Yeah. That's the $64,000 question, Eleanor. For me, I'm very attached to Tompkins' theory of affect, and for him, it's experience derived from neurological firing. And depending on how the firing, and this is a very metaphorical, loose understanding of neurological firing, depending on how it happens, one feels angry or excited or contemptuous or disgusted or so. So Tompkins has a theory of about 8 or 9 basic affects that co-assemble with each other, with thoughts, with behaviors to produce a kind of a rich psychological experience. There are other different kinds of theories of affect and circulation right now. That draw on different kinds of philosophical traditions. I mean, one of the ways that other tradition is usually thought of is through the work of Deleuze and Spinoza. And their affect is more, to quote Brian Masumi, impersonal. It's a force that would operate between people. And that tradition tends to be largely uninterested in the psychological feel or experience, the phenomenology of the affect for a particular person, and more interested in how it moves across social spaces and how those social spaces are reconfigured as a result of that. So canonically, Brian Masumi wrote a very influential piece on Ronald Reagan and the politics of fear. Does that help? And someone like Lauren Berlant, is kind of a little bit betwixt and between these kinds of traditions. So it's a very undefined term in general. And now I've forgotten the question. Oh, affect in the face. So yeah, Kerry, like this is a tough one, right? So for Tompkins, an affect actually happens on the face, and that is super interesting. So in the Darwinian tradition, Darwin says that an affect happens somewhere else in your body and it finds its expression on the face. So the face is just doing the secondary work of expressing what you already feel. Tompkins says no, what your face is doing when it's smiling, that is the enjoyment or the excitement. And when it's frowning or when you're crying, those are the feelings. So the face and the skin and the musculature on the face for Tompkins is really important. So that led to exactly the problems that you're talking about, Kerry. And in the book that Adam Frank from UBC in Vancouver, Adam Frank and I have written about Tompkins, Adam has written a very, very good chapter on the face and a critique of Ekman. So I don't know if this is too much in the weeds for some of the listeners, but Ruth Lees has been very, very critical of Tompkins' work and a lot of this work, scientific work on affect, saying it's too reductive. I think that is a good critique of Ekman. I think Ekman's work is very narrow. It works very nicely with the FBI and the TSA logics of having to try and find certain kinds of persons and extract them. I don't know if you've read the story that was circulating in the New York Times recently that the owner of Madison Square Gardens is now using facial recognition technology to remove people trying to come into events for political reasons. The people who are trying to sue the company. So there's all these kinds of usages of the face, and when you're talking about the Orientalism, I mean, I've just been teaching Joy Bullen-Winnie's work about how some of this facial recognition software can't manage gender and race very well.
Gender shades.
For me, yeah, exactly. It's terrific work. And so for me, this is a question about the difference between a project that's interested in recognition and a narrowly empirical project that's interested in recognition and all of the politics that attach to that on the one hand, and on the other hand, reading. And which I've said reading 100 times today. Reading, we all read faces. My students in my class, well, some of them, have just literally closed their eyes and fallen asleep. Others of them, you can tell by their faces that they seem interested or bored or whatever. So we're constantly reading faces. And I think what Tompkins' affect theory provides us is really capacious speculative theory for thinking about the face differently from what you're talking about in terms of Activa and Ekman and that whole tradition. So that's but what I will say, and this is the deconstructive DNA for me, you can't separate the interesting reading from the horror show that might be something like Activa. They're always connected.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. And I do think, I like sort of looking at this as sort of an interpretive project, or if something's saying, okay, we're always, coexisting with each other and we're involved in this process of mutual reading and how we read changes. But also recognizing the way that we have such an impulse to taxonomize and such an impulse to try and recognize. And, and again, Oz Keys talks about gender recognition software just, instead of saying it's biased, let's talk about it as just bullshit. Like, this is not something that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I wonder, is this what Michelle Alam was saying when she was talking about signs taken for wonders? The face you're looking for signs in the face, but those signs you take for something more sacred, something more fixed, more stable, an essence of a person. There's so much amazing. Go on.
Yeah, it's very complex, like what we do with faces.
Yeah, totally.
And now faces have been captured for capital, for national security, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and even thinking about the face of a brand or something, it's the outward side, it's the side that needs to be scrubbed clean so that the internals can do lots of shocking things. I wanted to just turn away from technology for a second. I mean, not that really we've been focusing on it much, which is always a good thing, because I think you find out more interesting things about technology when you don't talk about it. So one of the kind of really important part of queer politics is this idea that queerness is natural. And, when you hear Lady Gaga sing that, I was born this way, that's kind of what that's about. Mm-hmm. So if I'm born this way, I don't have a choice. So, get off my back, basically. And that's been really useful in lots of different kinds of queer politics. But you point out that saying that queerness is natural also implies that natural is good. And we shouldn't lose sight of how confusion, inversion, and other negative elements are at the heart of nature. So can you explain what the significance of that is?
Yeah, so this would go back to my attachment to psychoanalysis and to questions of negativity. And I'm very attached intellectually to this whole tradition in queer theory of reading for negativity. And there isn't a lot of it in feminist theory. So there isn't a lot of reading for the constitutive work of negativity. We tend to read for things that are negative that we should get rid of. Whereas the queer tradition is trying to say there's something about the negativity that's constitutional, necessary, a part of how things emerge as such. And so, yeah, I've written something recently about Karen Barad's idea of kind of a queer nature. And my feeling is that she underreads for what in another context we might call the tooth and claw of nature. So nature under Barad suddenly becomes our ally. It suddenly becomes something we can work with. And interestingly, she figures a lot of this through acts against nature, which is a term for sodomy. And I think that, sodomy retains, I think, certainly here in the United States, it retains its, what Jonathan Goldberg has called its world-destroying force. So I think a lot of the anti-trans politics that are being directed towards children right now here in the United States, just unbelievably cruel. And they are a response to what I would call the sodomitical nature of a trans child. Their gender is confusing, and their gender is also saying kind of fuck you to your gender norms. Like I'm not interested in this. So there's something that the trans child is representing that we could call sodomitical, and it's a really negative force, and it's being met with an enormous amount of cruelty. So this negativity for me is always there in nature. It's always there in the body. It's always there in gender. It's always there in sexuality. It's not something to scrub out. And I think actually a lot of right-wing politics do try to scrub out that negativity. And so it's always a little strange for me when I see someone like whose work is like terrific and immensely influential and very important think of nature without this kind of sodomitical kick in it, without its negativity. So she underreads for the confusion and the nastiness of the so-called natural world. And I just think the feminist readings would be stronger if we could attend a little bit more to that.
That's really fascinating. And I think what you say about our sort of hesitancy to engage with the negative, to me, really speaks to the Edelman's work in queer theory, No
Exactly.
Future. And
Yeah.
for our listeners, maybe if you haven't read this book, Edelman effectively argues that, one of the kinds of compulsive needs that we have as a society is to invest the child with this sense of kind of futurity and hope, and that queerness kind of flies in the face of that. But yeah, Edelman's work's very, very controversial in a lot of feminist studies, and there's been a lot of pushback against that, largely Munoz's Cruising Utopia. But my only reflection on this as a very non-well-read person is, my main takeaway from Lee Edelman's book is that film The Birds is terrifying.
Yes.
It's not giving you of birds, so thanks a lot, Hitchcock. But maybe there's something right in that like that fear of the complete awfulness of certain kinds of natural events in nature. So I feel slightly affirmed now, and that being my only takeaway.
Yeah, and I think it's right. And Edelman's new book, Bad Education, expands this argument about the attachment of negativity to the queer to say it's also attached to blackness and to transness, and interestingly to woman and the figure of woman. And that there is a lot of work that's kind of gone missing in contemporary feminist theory, a lot of work back in the 70s where, I'm thinking here in Fatigue, woman is this really caustic figure and a figure of negativity. So yeah, there's a lot to explore there under the auspices of negativity.
That's so fascinating. And I think, the time always flies so fast whenever we get an opportunity to chat to fantastic people like you. Thank you so much for such an interesting, lively, free-flowing conversation. It's been a real pleasure to have you on, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Lovely to see you both. Thank you so much for having me.
This episode was made possible thanks to the generosity of Christina Gore and the McArthur Foundation. It was produced by Eleanor Drage and Kerry McInerney and edited by Eleanor Drage.